All right, so now we're going to get into the really nerdy stuff. Now, whether you're a music producer yourself or just someone who's curious about to see what this whole process looks like, I mean, I find it's always interesting to see how other artists work, no matter what medium they operate in. It's always kind of cool to have somebody peel back the veil behind their art and actually show you, how all that stuff was made and stuff. So whether this is of use to you or you just find it interesting, I hope you dig it. But in this session, I'm going to really peel everything open and get into some of my favorite tricks and sound design things and just show you all the layers that comprise this particular track. Okay, let's get right into it. So this is the entirety of the track. So you can see there's like all in all, with all the various buses, all the instrumental layers, all the weird textural effects and blah-de-blah, all the guitar tracks, and even the effects returns and all that stuff. So 75 layers there, plus another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so 80, and then including the master bus, whether that counts or not, 81 tracks, whatever. This reference here, I'd used a Xylent track called Reality, which is a really dope track. But just to balance, like get an overall sense of the balance of the mix, especially for like a heavier drum and bass tune. Like his track is obviously much different than mine. It doesn't have guitars and all that stuff, but still I kind of wanted to have that kind of aggressive, heavy feel to it, but still super melodic. And so I just kept referencing back to it multiple times, especially while trying to balance out like the bass and the drums and everything else. But that's just hidden at the very bottom. At the top here, just like all of my other tracks, this is a little sidechain trigger thing. I've totally touched on this in previous videos as well, but basically what it is, just a very sharp transient, very short, that is lined up with the kick and then the snare. And what that does is it triggers the sidechain compressor that I have on here. So every time a kick and snare hit, it enables the compressor to duck down just for that duration of like a 16th note or something like that, and then allows just the drum to come through. You can see it working here. It's a very ubiquitous trick, I guess. Yeah, so that's at the top, that's all muted, whatever. How I have this routed typically is just I have a drum bus that has my kicks and snares and everything else, and then I'll have the everything else bus that I'll assign the aforementioned compressor to. This time around I found in certain parts like the snare wasn't punching through, so I actually I took a lighter, less affected version of that, or copy rather, of that very same compressor and dumped it onto the overheads bus. So everything here that's the overheads, like drum fills and cymbals and things like that, they're also ducking out, not as drastically as everything else, but still just a little bit, just to allow the snare transients to poke through just a little bit more. So the track actually starts out with this effect here. And what that was I'd recorded a sample, like I was mucking around with a bunch of virtual modular plugins. There's one made by a company called Softtube, just called Modular, and it's like a true emulation of all these little modular synthesizers and stuff. It's a world I pretend to know absolutely nothing about, but I was tinkering around with some of their presets and just like resampling them and ended up getting this little guy. So just had that fade in, and that's layered with, one day while I was preparing to record the guitars for it, actually as I was plugging in, any guitarist knows exactly what I'm talking about. Like if your amp or whatever is on and you plug your patch cable in, you always get that like hum and click and noise and whatever. And so I was like, wonder if I could just for funsies, just sample that and then also like kind of filter it in. So I recreated it and then applied a filter to it. And then as well, I just routed it out to the reverb here, which is just like this very massive reverb that a bunch of stuff is routed to, just to give things a bit more space. There's a lot of automation that gets routed to that particular send, but that's the intro. And then I guess on a track-by-track basis, the drums were originally this machine patch. So I just had this kit. It was one of the preset kits from, I think, an expansion that I bought from them, or maybe it came stock with the machine software. But either way, I ended up modifying a bunch of the stuff in there, like swapped out some of the samples with ones that better fit the song. In one of the very early studio diaries where I show how I'd made a bunch of this stuff, like how the track started, this was one of the first things I did, was just start programming these drums here. And as per always, I program all my stuff by hand, all these little velocities, like how hard or soft a drum is hit. I always just go in, first I would write in the note, and then manually adjust the velocity of it. You know, could I play all that stuff with a launch pad or something like that, or any other controller that has drum pads? Totally. Do I? No. And I've honestly just gotten so used to doing all this stuff by hand over the years. It's just super quick, because you program a section, and then you literally just, drag it around, copy, paste, duplicate, whatever. So it becomes super quick that way. And then once all that stuff, like these are all the regions here, like obviously some parts are more intensive than others. But ultimately, once all that stuff was done, I'd zeroed all the MIDI stuff out so it wasn't taking up any more processing power, kind of minimized the track, but not before exporting the individual stems. So that would be, the kick, the original machine snare, and then even just like all the overheads on their own track. Then I'd layered the original snare, and you notice it's going out to like the snare verb, so it has its own channel, and that's a virtual plate plugin. Layer that with a snare sample from a fella named Daniel Bergstrand, who's one of my favorite all-time metal producers, and he's known for creating these very massive sounding drums using, I think, room reverb, or just like the way that he mics and stuff. He's just like a wizard when it comes to that stuff. He's worked with a ton of people in Flames, Soilwork, like his resume is insane. But he released a sample pack, and I snagged it, and I've been layering it with a bunch of my snares since. So his original one sounds like this, and then layered with the other snare. So that snare provides that little sort of more crispy transient, and then this gives it more body. There's an additional track here with some reverse snare samples, and then I also, admittedly, don't tell anyone, lifted a sample from the reference track by Xilinx that I was using, just because that thing sounds massive. And when that thing comes in, actually a whole bunch of other stuff here ducks out. Yeah, like even on the guitar, I had inserted another compressor, like the entire guitar bus, and automated it only being on during that one section. I think there's a second time that happened somewhere near the end, but so you'll hear it. You'll actually, if you notice down here, so it's a very heavy duck that leaves room for just that one snare and nothing else. Moving on within the drum bus, I no longer have the original MIDI track that I'd used to program this, but this is basically a sample of a plugin called Steven Slate Drums. So anytime I need any sort of organic drum samples, like real recorded acoustic kits, especially when I use them in rock or metal productions, I'll usually reach for Steven Slate Drums. It's a sampler that I've used for many, many years, and their sounds are awesome. And it's not uncommon for me to actually layer their overheads, like the cymbals and the hi-hats and everything else, as well as toms sometimes, with more electronic sort of layered some drum samples, like for the kick and snare and stuff. So here is basically just a tom fill that I'd programmed in it and resampled. Later here, I'd sampled a China for the like the heavier bits. And speaking of which, I find that sometimes if you want the snare to sound a little bigger and just adding reverb and other layers on top isn't enough, if you throw a China like this, I'd figured this out when I was making Argyle Twinkle Toes back in the day. Part of the reason why the snare sounds quite large in that track, especially in the choruses, is because I did exactly this. So like without it, like, yeah, that reverse clap sample that comes in before that, before the snare hit, like that does add to it. But with the China layered in, it just has that longer tail and pretty cool. Other than that, they're just, good old crash samples. Nothing to write home about. That's pretty much the gist of it. That's the whole drum bus there. Now, on the kick channel, I did use like an SPL transient designer to cut down on some of the sustain from the machine drum. I always use the Slate virtual mix rack on all of my channels, just to kind of, like, it's literally on every single channel. You see an instance of it going down the line. What that does is it emulates kind of like an analog mixing console feel, and there's a bunch of different models in here, and it's very subtle, but if you have it on every single track and every single mix bus, and then if you were to turn all of it off, you would actually notice like a big difference. Like there's just some kind of a third dimensionality that these plugins add in a very subtle but very effective kind of way to the overall mix. And the other cool thing is they eat up very little processing power, so you can have them on dozens upon dozens of tracks without anything exploding. What else? Yeah, did some light EQing, got rid of some of the rumble on the kick just to tighten it up a little bit. The snare, very little there. Although I did have at some point, I used a Pultec EQ on the snare bus. That's the one that's combining the machine snare and the Daniel Bergstrom snare into one bus. Just gave it a small presence boost in the high end just to make it cut through a little more. Altogether, the drum bus sounds like this. I started using these solid state Logic plugins recently just because I got them. Some of them were bundled with one of my interfaces, the same interface that I use in a live context, and they're wicked. So this is kind of like a drum channel strip type thing, and used it to give the drums or the drum bus a little bit more saturation, a little bit of like compression and stuff, rather parallel compression. It's pretty dope. It's very subtly mixed in. It's not like going ham on it or anything, but it does. And then here just for funsies. Kind of fattens everything up and gives it a bit more presence and saturation. It's pretty sweet. Now moving on the everything bus, as I said before, I just have the one sidechain compressor and that's it. I guess if we want to go into the bass layer, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening here. So the actual basses themselves, I have what I call the mid basses. So there's that main pluck bass. I'm using pigments for it. This track is frozen, but use an API Vision channel strip to EQ it a bit, and I think there might have been a bit of compression in there. Once again, virtual mix rack. There's a high pass filter that makes room for the sub. The sub is a lot more boring tonally. It's just a operator patch that I built a long time ago, and I keep reiterating in my various productions. But yeah, very steeply EQ'd, between basically 23 and 100 hertz is all that's happening there, and ended up using this compressor. That clicking is from the sidechain compressor that's on the main bus, but the click gets hidden by everything else that happens in the mix. Contextually, you can never hear it. Just a byproduct of the latter iterations of Ableton's compressors, I guess. Yeah, pretty heavily compressed. If you were to render this out to audio, it would just be a big sausage type thing. You can... If you notice the meters on the side there's almost no movement whatsoever. It's just smashed. And then, yeah, virtual mix track on the end. Now, back to the mid-basses thing, I just found that this, while mixing contextually, those are the settings that worked, and added a little bit of saturation, just a very subtle amount to give them a bit more grit. And then the side chill bass here was another pigments patch. And what happens during the chill section is, at first, it starts out with the side chill bass in its full glory, and then what happens, you'll notice down here, I automate a low cut as soon as the sub hits. Just cleans it all up and makes the two play nicely together and all that. Not much else to that particular thing. And then I have the NAR bus, so that's going to be all of the gritty stuff, which I guess are still technically considered basses, but all of their low end is cut off, and they filter into they feed into this bus that hosts all this stuff. So in the chorus, this is what's going on behind the guitars and everything else. It's many hours of layering all that crap and designing all those sounds. I don't have the original, I can't even remember what they were all made with. It was a combination of Serum, Massive. I think there was some pigments, growly things. I was literally just flipping through a bunch of presets that had really cool sounds that I would then go in and automate the various macro controls and various other settings within the synths, and then resample them into audio files and then further chop them up and process them and do all this. Yeah, there's like tube screaming distortion pedals on there, like a bunch of EQ chains. I would usually drive preamp emulations like this Neve here to the point of distortion. I'm not going to unfreeze a bunch of this stuff because my computer will probably explode. It's starting to get on in years. Usually when I'm done processing stuff like this, I'll freeze it just to free up the processing power. Some of this stuff, let's actually analyze this. So yeah, there's virtual mix rack, high and low cuts, just to make sure it wouldn't interfere with like drum overheads and then any of the bass stuff. And then there's a vocoder here that adds a bit of noise to it just to brighten it up a bit. If I do too much of it, it's too much. Without it, so it's like a nice happy in between. That I think came from another modular messing around session. Same with this. So you'll notice here at the end of the session, after everything else, like the markers have stopped, there's nothing going on, I have like this little chopping block. And these are all the various sample things that I got from that one. So I recorded this like this long sausage file of just the modular plugin. I had it just sitting on its own track and then routed the input from it onto this audio track, hit record, and then, well, it was all like just recorded a bunch of stuff for. And there's like I did that several times over, and then what I did was just like comb through them all and just chopped up the little bits that I thought were interesting. And some of them made it into the actual session. Some of them I would cut together like this and then get one sort of consolidated file. So that you may recognize as the very ending of the song. And then there's also like this riser thing I found. Now obviously this is all routed to that same massive reverb. On their own, they're a lot more dry, but... And so some of these things you actually, sometimes depending on the note is playing, you notice actually once I started tuning the actual samples themselves, you're like, so I'd adjust them up and down by various semitones depending what note I was trying to get, because modular stuff by nature isn't pitch perfect, doesn't tend to be, so you kind of have to manually tune a bunch of it. So I'd be like either holding down a note on a tune synthesizer or even just a note on my guitar, and I would by ear try to actually pitch. And then sometimes you would have to like fine tune it and stuff, but anyway. Yeah, and a lot of these things, there's like a massive processing change as well. So here we have like Neve compressor being like overdriven a bit. That's where like I find preamp emulations, or just preamps in general, if you have like a really nice analog preamp, where its character really starts to shine is when you actually start pushing it beyond just being like a volume booster and you start actually distorting it, and that's when its real character really comes out. So like Neves like this are really known to be very fat and warm. But also crispy in some context. Yeah, I did some attenuation of some of the harsher frequencies that were coming out. Glue compressor, depending where the track is. There's some auto pan stuff happening. There's like a roll-in chorus that I'd used, and then a low cut just to clean up the low end and stuff. And so once I'd finished combing through all of these, I'd try to find a spot for them in the track. And yeah, hours and hours. Making all this stuff fit together like one super convoluted jigsaw puzzle. Now, I'll touch on the ending a bit, and I think I actually tried to save, I called it binary barf. Because I figured that'd be kind of a cool ending to it. So this one file here, that's the actual, what actually ended up making it as the ending of the track, is a consolidation of these three files that were separate recordings of me tinkering with. You'll notice that this echo here is deactivated because what I did was with that sample, cranked up the dry wet, like fully affecting the original signal, and then feedback, cranked that up to 99, 100%, whatever. And then what I would do is mess around with the timing of it. And by doing that, you get some really cool like pitch modulation stuff, like really weird glitchy effects you can get sometimes. And so I just recorded several cycles of myself doing that, like just tweaking that knob almost randomly, and then ended up with this. And then also layered it with the original sample too, just cause. So there's that. Now diving further into some of the growly bits, I did spend quite a bit of time. Like originally there was a different sample that I used. There's this, which contextually did fit fairly well. But I kind of just decided like, I'd rather just replace that growl, because the original idea that I had was to like wow or something. And to do that, there's a couple iterations of this, but essentially what's going on, pretty aggressive EQ times. In Serum, starting from scratch. I followed along with a tutorial by one of my favorite electronic producers, AU5, also known as Oss, and he has this kind of hyper growl tutorial. And what's kind of cool about it is every time you go through it, you always end up with a different result, even if you follow the steps to the T or whatever. But I can't take credit for all this. I'm not nearly savvy enough in the world of Serum sound design, whereas that guy's a veritable wizard. But the idea here is that it's this. Now I've got my launchpad active, like sitting in front of me, so I can trigger an F-sharp note. But essentially this LFO, this one LFO controls a ton of different things. It controls the weight table position, which I had dialed into a point where I liked how it cycled through the wave. It's funny because I was tinkering with this one morning, and then Becca came downstairs. She's like, stop that, you're fucking annoying. Like, I'm making Transformer fighting sounds. What do you want? Yeah, so it's controlling the wavetable position, it's controlling the cutoff for the filter. And then if we go over to the effects section, it's controlling the frequency of the EQ, which is like essentially a low pass filter. There's a bit of like hyper and dimension to it to give it some width. It's controlling same LFO is controlling a little bit of the phaser. I think a bit of the filter, then there's chorus, delay. It's actually here, why don't I turn all this stuff off? So without the effects, it's just, and then some width, smashed to all hell with what's essentially an OTT, and then some distortion at the end to kind of give it a bit more grit. That's basically the gist of it. And then the rest of the chain is just more saturation via 2 different plugins. So without all that stuff, it's subtle, but it still fattens it up a bit, and then EQ to get rid of any resonant frequencies and so on. So that was what made the growl in the first couple choruses. And then the second growl that I made for the end was actually the same chain. I literally just duplicated the track, but all I did different here was in Serum, I changed the LFO. So instead of that one arc going, it's actually 3 of them. And then there's a bit of, because I used it to play not the root note, but like other notes. And what I can do with this is, so in the actual, once I finished putting in all the automation and everything else, you'll notice that here, this track is taking the audio input from either one of these 2 things. So I just resampled it into audio, so I didn't have to have Serum on or whatever. Again, trying to conserve computing power on old Betty. She's getting old. I don't know why I called my computer Betty. So to get this, it's actually layered with this other one here. So there's a pitch bend. So it like slides up and then goes wow down. So that's it. Yeah, that's how I made the crazy hyper growl things. So going further down the list, like that was the Gnar bus, all the weird growls and things like that. We have this very boring noise effects channel. Just helps with all the various transitions, some impacts, just to give a little bit more weight to certain sections. I'd made some risers in Massive and then just resampled them. it's the same sound just with a different fade curve, I guess. Oh yeah, so to make that, I actually resampled the entire track, like the drums, like all the synth bits and stuff, and then just glitched the hell out of it, and then resampled that. I don't remember exactly what I did. Sorry. Very subtly blended in it. It actually adds like a cool... like to a couple of the big transitions. There's a pitch riser that I ended up using once or twice. Nothing that interesting there. Atmo. Yeah, just got like a sort of a weird, creepy breath. Yeah, there's a pigments thing here with like a heavily delayed. The pad was just a pigments patch, which is just decimating my CPU, which is why it's off. I had to like render that to audio, otherwise my computer was going to explode. And there's another pad that I used, also using pigments. I don't remember which patch exactly, but the difference there is, well, this is the original sound, I guess. So it's EQ to blend in with the other one. But the other thing that's going on here is this gatekeeper plugin, which is, in this case, it's acting as a gate, so it's like only letting in some of the sound. So without it, silky smooth, and with it, and then layered with the other pad, in the verse, found kind of like a 90s bass organ thing. I've always had a soft spot for that kind of sound. Maybe it's because I just grew up with like 90s dance music to a degree, and so it sounds like this. As well, I guess I should backtrack a little bit here. So Pigments has a lot of really dope lead sounds that come from the factory. I'm a big fan of using a lot of their presets. I see no shame in that. Some people will castigate you for using presets, but I think if you find a sound that's really dope, by all means include it. Sure, make it your own, process it your own way, but no shame in that. I mean, I don't build the guitars that I play, so, you know. Anyway, one of the leads that follows along with like the guitars is this guy. Bow, bow. Bow, bow. You get it. It's automating some stuff there. There's some saws that ended up coming in. And those saws are actually prevalent throughout the chorus as well. They're a little more subtle. It's kind of hard to hear them. They're very buried in the mix, but they do add to its density. And then finally, there's the main lead. Yeah, I guess I could put in freeze it and hope nothing explodes. Pigments, very fancy. We'll just take all this stuff off and just add it. So that Neve preamp, once again, being driven, gives it a bit more crispness. Virtual mix rack. Use this Neve EQ, which is pretty cool. So that's really just filtering out all the frequencies that I don't need, because it is kind of a fat lead and eats up a lot of space in the mix. So filtering them out and either boosting or cutting certain frequencies to help it sit better with everything else. An optical compressor, a classic go-to. Also, further in the verses, I had the 7th plucks. Some subtle EQing there, again, make it sit better with everything else that's going on. One more thing in the synth land is these Serum Hypersaws, which I believe is just one of the stock patches, but I use it a lot in a lot of my tracks because they're just very dense, very thick, very pleasantly fuzzy sounding, smooth. So what all those little stab hits do is just give a little bit more initial oomph, I guess, to each chord in this chorus variation. And that's literally the only part they have to play in this whole thing. Now, on to the guitar tracks. So I have one master bus for all this stuff, roll off at 90 hertz, which I find is kind of a good point, because if any higher, and especially like down-tuned guitars start to sound pretty thin, any lower, and they start to kind of muddy up the mix, especially when they start clashing with the bass and stuff. Typically how I have all this routed, depending on the types of guitars that are in the track, I might have like a heavy rhythm bus, which has all the distorted guitars in it, clean buses. I had like a little bit of acoustic guitar in this recording as well. And they're all processed a little differently, but also same. I do use, like whenever I track guitars, there's a chain that I always use. So there's an SSL channel strip here, and does just a little bit of basic filtering. So same thing, there's like a roll off at about 90-ish. I'll usually cut off guitars around 8 to 8.5 kilohertz, just because then there's some brightness and stuff that exists above that frequency, but I find it tends to clash a bit with like the drum overheads and stuff like that. And generally somewhere between that range is where the real meat of the guitars is anyway. And sure, on its own, they sound a little duller, but in the context of a mix, they tend to play quite nicely. And this is the way I've done it for years and years and years. Yeah, there's a little bit of a compression that happens here, about 4:1 ratio. It's hard to really show all this stuff in action without having a guitar signal being run through it right now. But A, if I turn this chain on right now, the session would explode, and B, I don't want to turn my guitar stuff on. So whatever, maybe next time. And then just like some subtractive EQs in this Cambridge here. It's very transparent, very surgical. Like whereas this adds a fair bit of color in a very pleasant way to the signal. This will cut out any sort of weird resonant frequencies and just cleans up the signal a bit before it hits the DAW. And then I'll usually have like this oxide tape plug-in to give it a bit more tape-like saturation. With the help of the UA stuff, I always have this recording thing on. All these effects are being applied to the recording of these stems, which is why there's no processing on the actual tracks themselves. But on the rhythm bus, I'll just do virtual legs bus, filter out any other frequencies that start clashing with the mix. I'm a big fan of this API 550 EQ. And here what I'll do is at about 800 hertz. But generally I find somewhere in those mids is a good idea to duck out the guitars, because it leaves room for a bunch of the synths to cut through. And I always mix this contextually. Like I don't solo them out when I EQ them, because you always want to mix it in context. But basically whenever I record guitars, I will quadruple track the various parts and hard pan them like 2 at a time. You notice here it's 50 to the left, which in Ableton is all the way to the left, and then these two are all the way to the right. Same with like these other parts. So what's going on here, for example, this is that build at the very intro. Because quadruple tracking it like this just ensures that there's like a wall of guitars. And especially with like heavier like metal style genres, that's what you want. It sounds beefy, because like, yeah, even just 2 tracks on their own, pretty cool. When you have 4, it's subtle but beefy. And then later in this specific build, for example, I have 2 other tracks, like leads that come in. which layer with all this stuff. The octave harmony just gives it a bit more, build intensifies, gives it that feeling. Now, if I'm making non-electronic music, sometimes I'll be a little bit less harsh with my cuts. I'll let some of the guitars like kind of lead over and carry through, but here I'm being quite surgical with it just because of the, I guess, grid precision that's involved with electronic music, and as well like the way that all the synths and everything else are layered, like it just makes sense to not have any like tails bleeding over too much and whatever. And then as well, whenever I start layering harmonies like this, I'll actually, instead of having all the same panning, like just hard pan left and right, I'll start to kind of, you notice here there's a bit of automation that starts happening. So whereas like the actual rhythm tracks are still all the way left and right, and then some of the harmonies that start coming in are actually like not quite all the way left and right. So instead of like 50, it's 46, and then 45 or some of the other layers. So just making use of the stereo field to make sure everything has a place and fits. And then as everything goes on, the actual rhythm bus, there's an SSL bus compressor on it that just thickens everything up. So without it, it's a fairly subtle amount of compression, but it does glue all the guitar parts together a bit, especially in the more intensive sections like this where there's a lot of layers happening. Oh yeah, and in this bit, so I used my EBow, which is kind of a cool, like, if you're not familiar, I guess it uses like a magnetic field or something, and it stimulates the strings to vibrate, and it gives you an infinite sort of sustain. I love layering individual notes to form chords, and to get like these. It gets really hard sometimes to operate that thing correctly, especially when you have like in this patch on my Helix, I have several reverbs and delays stacked together. So as soon as you like touch a string, the whole thing rings out and then reverberates forever, and you have to like just sit there and wait while it finishes its thing so you can hit record again. But that's what gave it that cool sort of tail into the side chill section. For the acoustic guitars, I had this, which I'd used the Aston Origin microphone in front of a rented Martin acoustic. Nothing fancy to write home about, but I was quite liked the combination. Very subtle stuff, not a lot to it. A little bit of EQ, tiny bit of compression. And I actually recorded this. You'll notice there was a tail here, and if you saw the original video of me playing through this thing on Instagram as I was recording it, there was a tail, but it didn't fit with everything else that was going on in the next section, so instead I just took it, dragged it over, reversed it to get... This kind of blends the guitars in more naturally than instead of like an acoustic coming out of the blue. So onto the clean guitars. Nothing terribly fancy going on here. Just same thing, panned hard left and right. Fairly subtle effects chain, just some delay. Even though the original already had a little bit of delay on it, like the actual Helix patches. A little bit of tape saturation, a little bit of subtle compression, and to further save CPU space, once again, rendered it down to audio. Really, that's about the gist of it. I mean, some of the guitar tracks do send out to effects returns. So I'm a big fan of using rooms, like room reverbs, very subtly to glue certain elements together, make them sound as if they're in a room. Otherwise, they're just in your face artificially, and that's just not how music works in the real world, or how sound works in the real world. So now I've heard of people using different reverbs for different types of instruments, and sometimes it's considered a faux pas to just route a bunch of instruments to the same room verb, but I guess it depends contextually much as anything else. I do think that if you imagine yourself being in the room with kind of like a band with everybody playing whatever they're playing, like all of these different instruments, if they were being played in a room all together, like it would sound like they're in the same room, right? Yeah, there's that like a separate snare verb, and then there's that massive synth verb that a bunch of stuff routed to for effect. Same with the delay here. I just use a simple delay from like the built-in Ableton one. And the GAT verb, GATs are what I call guitars. Those are, you'll notice here, like it's routed very subtly to that same thing because the guitar bus is routed to the guitar verb room thing. It's very subtle, again, but with it, just that little tail right at the very end. Without it, it's super subtle, but it does add a very subtle psychoacoustic effect. Like if it wasn't there, you would notice it subconsciously. So, I mean, yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. Finally, on the master bus, I didn't have a ton of stuff going on, so I use SonarWorks for monitoring. It's a calibration that's applied to my speakers and headphones that kind of flattens out the frequency response of my gears. Then it just makes for a more accurate listening environment. Highly recommend it. Use it literally every day. They have a really good blog if you're into production and stuff. A lot of really useful stuff there. Definitely check them out. I just have this saturation plugin, which just kind of adds a bit of color to everything. And also, yeah, just some tape saturation here as well. So without them all, just a final bit of color before I actually took all of this and bounced out for the mastering session, which is in it's a different Ableton file altogether. Yeah, so once I'm done doing all the mixing stuff, I'll go through it, make whatever micro adjustments that I have to, and once I deem it to be completed, then select the markers, hit export, and then get onto the mastering thing. Now, there is a little bit of bonus here. I guess the cut outtake, the director's cut, if you will. While I was ideating riffs for this track, I did just copy over like a section of the drums from the chorus. I recorded some additional guitar riffs, which I thought were going to make themselves known at some point. Like I'd figured, like this lead here. That was a riff that I wrote on the guitar initially, and so I built upon it, but that never made it into the track, and I think I'm actually going to make a totally different track using these riffs. I've actually, in a totally different session, I tried making it into like a funk riff with a bit of swing, and it's going kind of cool so far. So this might be the very first sneak preview into like some subsequent production. I don't know, but here's what it sounds like. So there you go. Little bonus. Wow. That's it for the mix thing. All right. We made it to the end. So I'll just make this really quick because I'd say mastering is very much a fledgling skill of mine. It's not something I consider myself to be particularly excellent at by any stretch of the imagination. I only really started doing it about a year and a bit ago, just deciding that I didn't have the schmeckles to shell out to pay like a real mastering engineer to do it, and I've had very mixed results with automated mastering services, which in some cases can be pretty effective. I just prefer to have a bit more control over my stuff right up until the very end. So I don't use the same chain every time. It kind of varies from project to project, but typically what I'll have is like I'll have another instance of the virtual mix bus, the Oxford inflator, which is just voodoo when it comes to like nobody really knows what it does, and I guess the actual engineers who made it aren't legally allowed to disclose exactly how it works. So, but it's just one of those like very few magic plugins where you turn up the effect and it just somehow fattens up and adds something really nice to the mix, and it just kind of glues it together without being a dynamics processor and without being like a saturator or an equalizer. Like it's witchcraft. And then I'll have some kind of like subtractive EQ where like very, very small moves, like within a decibel or two, just finding whatever resonant frequencies exist in the mix, induct them out a little bit just to give myself a little bit more headroom to work with and a little more just to clean it up a little bit. I guess in this session, I'd use the Ozone equalizer too, some mid-side type EQ. So there's a high pass at about 34 hertz, so it just cleans up some of the rumble that exists in the track, and just like some subs that are hard to hear on most systems, but some of the ones that I'd reference, I could definitely hear it, and this just helped clean it up. And then on the side channels, cleaned up everything below, I guess, about 154 hertz, because there isn't, or in this particular case, I didn't find there's a lot of useful information in the side channels that was below that frequency, so just gave me more headroom to work with. After that, there's this BX digital mastering EQ, and just very, very minor adjustments based on what I felt the mix needed at that point, like within 0.5 to 1 decibels. And I think it was partially to kind of try to match the tonality of the aforementioned reference track. From there, there's this like a Shadow Hills compressor, which is really like 2 or 3 compressors in one. There's like an optical compressor, there's a discrete compressor, and I think overall it was doing maybe a total of like 2 decibels worth of reduction throughout the course of the mix. Just glues everything together, also adds a bit of character to it using like these multi-material. From what I recall, these are just different flavors of compression. Like this is nickel is a little bit more discrete, and then as you get into the steel, it's a little bit more colorful and saturated, just gives it a little bit of edge. Like I guess like this is one of the most renowned and well-loved mastering compressors in the industry. It's pretty fancy. I find it sounds very fat and smooth, and I've used it on quite a lot of my stuff. There's some multi-band compression going on here. Very subtle amounts of reduction on these various bands, like within, same thing, 1 to 2 decibels. Bit of an imager situation here. Stereo imagers like this it's extremely easy to make or break, like a mix or master with them, and the only thing I'm doing here is just like on the very, very high end, I'm just increasing it by about like 6%. Just make it like a little tiny bit wider, but not a lot. And then finally, the maximizer. And here, I think even like the highest peaks, there's no more than like 3 to 5 decibels of reduction for like a split second within those. And then finally on the master bus, yeah, I had Sonarworks that I was monitoring through, and then Insight. With most of my stuff, I don't aim to make it really loud. I don't anticipate my tracks landing in DJ sets, so I'm not trying to push them to a competitive level in that regard. I just try to make them exist somewhere in a happy medium between like what streaming targets are for Spotify and Apple Music and all that stuff, and just where I find it's adequately loud compared to my references, and but still retains dynamics and isn't overly squashed. So I'll usually aim for somewhere between like -7 to -10 LUFS. I think this one ended up being around -9 or 0.5 or something like that, which is plenty loud. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to bother playing this through or showing the meters or whatever. That's just the settings that I've used in this particular instance. Whether you gain something from that or not, I don't know. But once again, thanks for watching it, and if you made it all the way through to the end, maddest of props to you. You are my favorite. So there it is. I hope you find that interesting, and I'll see you next time.